So yeah, 2-hour time cap like before. Pretty self-explanatory. You guys are kind of getting it at this point. So today we're talking about fertilization, pregnancy. Last Monday we talked about the reproductive system and we walked through male and female reproductive systems. We're going to be talking about fertilization and implantation and how that occurs, the steps of labor, steps of development even before that, and then we're going to kind of discuss how substances are exchanged between the mother and the fetus. We talked about that in lab a little bit. We can anticipate and know that most of the nutrients and things that the mother is eating are getting to the fetus. And then we're also going to define a teratogen. Okay, so gamete formation. The word gamete means sex cell. Okay, so these sex cells, where are they formed? Okay, so we know a sperm and an egg comes together, gets fertilized, and creates a zygote. But where are those gametes or those sex cells, those eggs and sperm cells produced? Well, we know that eggs are produced in biological females and sperms are produced in biological males. Okay, the sperm we talked about last Monday are created in the testes. We talked about that pathway in which the sperm is created and then expelled out the penis. We then talked about the female reproductive system and how the eggs are developing in the ovaries where they mature post-puberty, and they kind of travel and either get fertilized or the menstruation cycle occurs. So one egg is ovulated at day 14, okay? It's not just every day 14 that an egg is ovulated. This can be a range of days depending on the individual's diet, lifestyle, things like that. So it says day 14, but understand that that's not just like a end all be all there. It is guided into the fallopian tube and remains viable for about 24 hours. So as you can see, when I said it's about a range, so if it says day 14 and it's viable for 24 hours, that can also be a range of time as well. Sperm then are deposited in the vagina and they transport through the female tract, depends on the sperm's motility and the uterine environment, okay? So what that means is I guess I don't really have a better description of this, but how well are the sperm swimming, right? And what uterine environment are we giving those sperm? So did they have a good enough pH buffer? Were they able to, survive in that pH environment, in that temperature environment, and things like that? And then the sperm remain viable for 4 to 6 days. So that's also a range of time. So this is not something that can just either happen or doesn't. It's actually kind of this like range of time where if the ranges of times kind of line up, fertilization would occur. Here's a little bit more of a descriptive picture of fertilization. So here we have that ovulation that happens at day 14, or that range of time around day 14, okay? And then this egg is guided down the fallopian tube. The sperm, however, are deposited into the vagina and they can last for 4 to 6 days. We talked about that. Here's a picture of a bunch of sperm, which you can't really tell unless I tell you, but all of these are sperm right here, these little blue things on this egg, okay? And they're all trying to essentially fertilize the egg, okay? I think about it like I guess we can't really relate to it right now, but like a really crowded like train station or a really crowded airport, and it's like they've got one seat and like all of these sperm want to get on the train. So as you can see, one was fertilized there, and the egg, and we'll talk about this, actually has a system in which it can recognize when a sperm was kind of deposited or embedded, and it then doesn't allow other sperm to continue to do what it's trying to do. We'll talk about that in a little bit. It says, how long does it take the sperm to reach the cervix and the oviduct? It can take, like it says, 4 to 6 days, which is good because the sperm can last that long. Here's another example, a little bit more descriptive picture of fertilization. So the sperm makes its way through the cornea radiata. Okay, this is the sperm right here. This is the obvious tail. It's a flagella tail, so that's why I referenced the sperm as to be swimming, because they kind of have this like back and forth motion. Okay, we've got the middle piece here and the head. The head is where the DNA information is located, okay? And then you have a plasma membrane, and where it says nucleus, that's why I said the DNA information. The nucleus is located inside of the head of the sperm, okay? And remember, the sperm, they don't have a conscience. They are literally created to pass on genetic material, and that is their job. The acrosomal enzymes digest a portion of the zona pellucidea, which I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but essentially the enzymes of the sperm are essentially going through the egg, because the sperm wants to essentially deposit the genetic information and fertilize the egg, and we're going to see that here in a second. The sperm binds to and fuses with the egg's plasma membrane, as you can see in that third picture. The fourth picture is where the sperm nucleus enters the cytoplasm of the egg. So then it kind of gives the egg the nucleus and gives them the genetic information. And then after that, the enzymes of the wall of the egg kind of come back together, and the fertilization happens, where the sperm and egg are enclosed in a nuclear envelope, which is kind of shown down here. So you can kind of see how that one sperm made it through the kind of wall or the lining of the egg, deposited the genetic information, and then they kind of moved forward in those steps. So here's another, if you're more of a word person or like a list kind of person, this is your slide right here to understand a little bit more about fertilization. So several sperm penetrate the layer of cells. The sperm enzymes digest a portion of the extracellular matrix around the outside of the egg. The sperm binds to and fuses with the egg's plasma membrane. Okay, we know plasma membrane, we've seen it before. That word should look somewhat familiar. We saw that word when it comes to cells, and the outside of cells have a plasma membrane. The sperm nucleus enters the egg. We know that genetic information is most likely stored in the nucleus, so that makes sense, right? So the sperm are giving the genetic information, or the DNA, to the egg, and the sperm and egg nuclei fuse, okay? We also know from meiosis that eggs have 23 chromosomes, and sperm have 23 chromosomes. I'm just going to put CHR. You guys should know what that is. There we go. Write it out. And so when they fuse together, we would have a diploid cell. Remember this a little bit? A diploid cell. And then it has 23 pairs, or 46 chromosomes. Okay? So that's kind of what happens with the number of chromosomes. The eggs and the sperm cells have half the number, and they fuse together. Changes in the egg plasma membrane prevent more than one sperm from entering the egg. So that's what I was talking about a little bit, is where the egg has this system in which it can recognize, to a certain extent, when a sperm has deposited the genetic information, so that it can kind of block it off on the rest of the outside of the egg, so that not billions of sperm are trying to fertilize this one egg, okay? So the reason we don't want more than one sperm fertilizing an egg is because guess what? This sperm has 23 chromosomes, and then so does this one, and so does this one. They all have 23 chromosomes. So if you were to give this one egg, you know, double the amount of chromosomes on one side, it's going to be an astronomical amount of chromosomes. It would not be a viable zygote for that purpose, okay? And then the question comes, like with twins, right? You're like, how do twins work then? Well, 2 eggs and 2 sperms were fertilized in that sense. Or it also has to do with the division and replication, which we can talk about a little bit more about that later. Okay, this is just a really cool picture to show the egg with like a lot of sperm around it and how they're all trying to essentially fertilize the egg. This is taken with an electron microscope. So that's pretty cool. We can see the surface, we can see the 3D structure, the shading. That's pretty an informative picture, which is great. All right, so the couple of things that we have circled here are fertilization and implantation. So those are the things we kind of started to talk about with fertilization. Implantation is what comes next, okay? So this is right after the egg and sperm fuse their nuclei together, okay? This is like days 1 and 2 after this happens. The first cleavage furrow extends between the 2 polar bodies. Okay, that's a weird sentence. What that means is a cleavage furrow we talked about with mitosis, and a cleavage furrow is where 2 cells are trying to kind of separate. So when you have mitosis, remember we replicated, we lined up, we separated, divided, and we created new cells. That cleavage furrow is the same one right there. Okay, so these cleavage furrows are ready to split. It later cuts or angled, so the cells become asymmetrically arranged until the 8-cell stage forms. They are loosely organized with space between them. Okay, so this is the very, very beginning. We're talking cellular level here. We now have like 2 to 4 cells. Okay, that's very small. Okay, then at day 3, after the 3rd cleavage, cells abruptly huddle into a compact ball, which tight junctions among the outer cells stabilize. Tight junctions is another word we've seen before. This is kind of that space between the 2 cells. Got lots of drawings today. Okay, so if you have cells like this, okay, if we look at this space between them, because even though they're so small, you do have to think there is space between them. Even when I put my hand on this table, there is space between my hand and the table. It's hard to think about that because it's so small and it feels like there's nothing between there, but there actually is space between there. This could be considered a tight junction. The other ones we've talked about before are like gap junctions and things like that. But the one we're talking about right now is a tight junction between these cells that are in a tight compact ball on day 3, okay? Day 4, by 96 hours, there is a ball of 16 to 32 cells shaped like a mulberry. Anybody like mulberries? Never really had mulberry, I don't think. Or are those considered blackberries or are those different?
Different, but I've never even really seen a mulberry in real life. Not sure if they
I think
exist.
they're just more like purple, like a reddish color rather than.
Like the same thing as a blackberry, but
Yeah.
not a blackberry.
Okay, well, if anybody sees them at Hy-Vee, let me know. I'm
They're
gonna
like
try.
mini cherries or something.
Okay.
I have a few trees in my backyard.
Okay, that's
A
cool.
mulberry tree?
Yeah,
Also, they're like cherries?
yeah, they're like tiny little. Actually, well, they're like so you think about, they're more like raspberries, but
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
berry, in the berry family.
Yeah, in the
Yeah.
berry family. Okay, so we're growing a berry. It is a morula, which is after morum, Latin for mulberry, so that's pretty cool. Cells of the surface layer will function in implantation and will give rise to a membrane, the coronion. Okay, so essentially all we're doing here is just making more cells and more cells and more cells. Right now, this division, we could also call it mitosis. Okay, we're not creating sex cells in this moment. We are literally replicating and dividing and creating identical daughter cells over and over and over. And as you can see, it's happening rapidly, but maybe not as rapidly as you think, because only after day 4, we have 16 to 32 cells, depending on when you look at it. So that's not a lot of cells, right? You'd think it just like grow and grow and grow and grow, and it's not that fast. But because it's exponential, each cell then can divide on itself, which after a while, it does become a lot more exponential growth here. Day 5, a blastule, a fluid-filled cavity, forms in the morula, like mulberry, as a result of the surface cell secretions. By the 32 cell stage, differentiation is occurring in an inner cell mass that will give rise to the embryo proper. The embryonic stage is the blastocyst. Maybe you've heard of that word before. So now we have this kind of like fluid-like cavity. Okay, think of it kind of like a little bit of a water balloon. So we've got these cells, we have like a little bit of like a water balloon type situation. And this is on the 32 cell stage. Okay, so we've got 32 cells now, but this is where we start to have differentiation. What differentiation means is the cells are going to be able to do different things now. So up until this point, I told you that they were dividing like mitosis and we were making identical daughter cells. Now we're going to have some specifics here, which is important. From days 6 to 7, some of the blastocyst surface cells, that's hard to say, attach themselves to the endometrium. We know the endometrium, it's in the lining of the uterus, and start to burrow into it. Implantation has started, and here's a little bit of a picture there on the right-hand side. This is the endometrial epithelium. So epithelial cells are a type of tissue. The cavity inside of the uterus, this is the surface layer of the cells on the blastocyst. Here's the blastocell and the inner cell mass. So here's that kind of fluid-like cavity, and there's those 32 cells, and they essentially, like it says, implantation onto the epithelial wall. The placenta. This is something you maybe heard of before. You maybe seen it in movies or things like that, or in real life. This contains blood vessels and endometrium. This is also where the umbilical cord is attached. But the placenta, it kind of serves as this control center, as an organ of exchange between the mother and the fetus, okay? It's the exchanges of gases and the nutrients and the wastes. The placenta is doing the hard work, right? And it's an organ that we can't, well, it's an organ, like an organ, I guess it is an organ, that the fetus needs to survive. The bloodstreams do not mix. So this is really important, okay? And we don't want the bloodstreams to mix because it's possible that the fetus or the baby has a different blood type than the mother, and we don't want them to mix, especially if they have the antigens of the opposite person, right? If baby has an antigen for mom's blood, that could be an issue. All right, so the bloodstreams don't mix, but the placenta is able to kind of break down, get the gases and the nutrients that the fetus or the baby needs, and give that nutrients to the baby. So usually the saying is, it's like whatever mom eats, baby eats, kind of that theory here. All right, here's another picture of that placenta, okay? It's up here on the top, just to give you a little bit of context. Oh, man, that's a bleached out picture. There's a better picture if you look at it on your own laptop. The colors are a lot better. This is the uterus around the outside here. The maternal blood, oh, sorry, that's on the other side. The umbilical cord is here attached to the placenta, and the placenta has these veins and arteries, which we blew up for a picture right here on the right-hand side. So veins are blue, arteries are red. Remember, arteries go away from our heart and are supplying our body most likely with oxygen, depending on what we're at in the process, but in this case it does. And veins are going to bring the waste away from the baby and towards our heart so that we can exhale carbon dioxide, any other nutrient waste and things like that, okay? So here we have the fetal portion of the placenta on the bottom. Okay, so this is meaning that it's the part of the placenta that the baby kind of recognizes, not really recognizes, that's the wrong word, but associates with. And then you have the maternal portion of the placenta, okay? The umbilical cord has veins and arteries in it, okay? And then you have the fetal arteriole and venules right here. We know the word arterioles and venules because we talked about that in the heart section of this class. That happened with gas exchange. And then you have the maternal arteries and veins. And as you can see, the bloodstreams don't really ever mix. They've got this kind of lining, but there is a gas exchange going on so that the oxygen from the mom and the carbon dioxide that's getting out of the body is all kind of going through that placenta. So it's very important. Okay, so this is kind of a silly couple of slides here. So the phrase, I might be pregnant, okay? Maybe you've had a friend tell you this, maybe your mom or your sister, your aunt, whoever has said this. If somebody says they might be pregnant, okay, these are the clues that would be that you might be pregnant. The next slide is going to say, well, this is what actually happens if you are pregnant, okay? So some hints that I, as the hypothetical person here, there is a cessation of the menses, which means the menstrual cycle halts, it stops, okay? There's some nausea with or without vomiting, frequent urination, fatigue or being really tired, breast tenderness or fullness or enlargement, and an enlargement of the abdomen. Okay, that one starts to get a little bit kind of obvious when you think about it, but all of these can happen and still mean that you're not pregnant, okay? So what the next slide is like, if this happens, then you're actually pregnant, all right? So if you're actually pregnant, you're gonna have a positive pregnancy test, you as the hypothetical person. You will have a visualization of a pregnancy on an ultrasound and the identification of a fetal heartbeat. Has everybody maybe heard in person or on a movie of like a fetal heartbeat? Is it higher or lower than a normal heartbeat? Higher or lower? Yeah, it's higher. Yep, so it's almost, I don't want to say double. Usually it's like 130 to 160 beats per minute, which is like if you were to go out for a nice jog, your heart rate would probably get about that high, but that's consistent throughout most of the second and third trimester of the pregnancy. So what I just referenced was a trimester. You maybe have heard of these referenced before for pregnancy. The first trimester, this is that main period of organ development. Okay, so we break pregnancy up into 3 trimesters. It helps to understand a little bit about development and what goes on in each trimester. It's just a form of measurement. It's not necessarily like the baby recognizes like today is the first trimester and tomorrow is the second trimester. That's not really what's going on. It's just a way for us to kind of visualize, recognize what's kind of going on in this range of time, because development happens at different rates. It can happen for different individuals and things like that. So like I said, first trimester is that main kind of period or time of organ development. So all the organs, lungs, heart, and I'm going to lose some, liver, stomach, intestines. We start to have this main development stage in the first trimester. The nervous system begins to develop. The development of the heart begins. Hands and feet start to be present. The head enlarges. So most of the time, if you see a ultrasound at like 20 weeks, the head looks really big. Eyes, ears, nose become prominent, and the embryo is about 1.5 inches at this kind of time range and about 1 ounce. So 1.5 inches is about like that, okay? And 1 ounce is about a couple paper clips probably. 1 paper clip is 1 gram, but I can't think of what a gram to an ounce is right now. But it's not very much. So here's 4 weeks. The fetal size is not measurable because it's just a little thing of cells right now. Even though it's more than 32 cells, because we know it was 32 cells at about 6 to 7 days. This is 4 weeks, so you take that times about 4. What you're seeing here though, the small circle at the center is called the gestational sac, okay? Some cells will become part of the placenta and some will form the amniotic sac that will fill with fluid to cushion and develop the fetus. We kind of talked about this in lab the other day because we kind of made an amniotic sac for our little eggs that we did, because we soaked those eggs in vinegar, removed the hard shell around the outside, and then put them in either water, alcohol, or food coloring. And that amniotic sac was simulated for us. So now we have that going from an embryo to a fetus. So sometimes you hear me kind of throw the words out like embryo, fetus, zygote, baby. It's all about what time in a certain amount of weeks and what developmental stage that this, I guess, body of cells is in. So at week 4, it's considered an embryo, and from week 5 to 6, it turns to a fetus. So you can see here at the bottom that the yolk sac and the connecting stalk and the embryo, it's starting to have kind of that look of what you think it would have when you think of like, oh, pregnancy. You Google pregnancy and you maybe come up with a couple of pictures. Like this is kind of like that ultrasound picture, but like this looks kind of weird. It looks like a bunch of stuff. It just doesn't really have any characteristics, right? But then after 5 to 6 weeks, it becomes a fetus. And then we see that head is enlarging. You can start to kind of see where the hands and the feet would be. They're almost kind of like fin-like, if you can kind of see that, the webbing between the fingers and things like that. At 8 weeks, the upper and lower limbs are well formed. Okay, so this is where the umbilical cord would be attached. The upper and lower limbs are distinct more, like it says, they're kind of more developed. The toes have separated. I talked about how they looked like webbed feet at first. Now they're separated. Tissues of all internal and external structures have now developed, and the tail has become stubby. Here's an ultrasound picture of at 8 weeks. The fetal size is now 0.6 inches. So we're still in that first trimester because at the end of the first trimester, we're going to be that 1.5 inches here. And we're 0.04 ounces. What you're seeing in this image, the embryo is lying on its back, so the dorsal side is down, and when its head is to the right of the screen. So this would be the head over here. All right, let's talk about 12 weeks. This is a 3D ultrasound. And the reason they do 3D ultrasounds is to check for a lot of the external surface anatomy of the fetus. Here you can see the umbilical cord, which is really cool, the arms, the enlarged head, and the distinct upper and lower limbs, so like the arms and the legs. Okay. We now transition to that second trimester, okay, and this is where the fetus is growing and just becoming very active. So if you've ever heard of somebody say like, oh, the baby's kicking and stuff like that, or it's moving, I can feel it moving. That's where you'd start to see in the second trimester. It doesn't always happen at the same time for everybody. Developmental stages happen at different rates. And at this one, you can determine the sex or the gender, able to distinguish at this state. I think it's at 20 weeks. You can also determine the gender earlier with a blood test. And some people do it earlier with a blood test, and some people wait for like, I think it's the 20 or 25 week ultrasound, and I'm not 100% for sure which week it is. Hair starts to develop. The heartbeat can be heard. The head slows in growth. So up until now, we kind of were having this enlarged head. It slows in growth so that the body's length can catch up, and the cartilage begins to be replaced by bone. So in the last couple of slides, when we were looking at the fetus between weeks 4 and 8, it's mainly made up of cartilage being the same thing that makes up your nose and your ear and some parts of your knee. And which is structured, right? We could see that the fetus had some shape and structure. So it's not just like a pool of skin by any means. It had structure, but it is flexible, and it's probably not as protective as bone. But in the second trimester is when that bone starts to develop. As you can see on the bottom, we go from 3 to 12 inches, and we go from 1 ounce to 24 ounces. So we're getting bigger, we're getting longer. This is at 20 weeks here. Okay, he says it's a, because sometimes they'll put like it's a boy on there, things like that. Here's the head over to the right. Okay, you can also kind of see if they were trying to figure out the sex of the baby. Okay, The baby on the right and the baby on the left are different sexes. Can you tell the difference between baby on the right and baby on the left? Might have to look at it on your own laptop if you can't see. Right here and right here. Tell the difference between a girl and a boy. But don't start a forest on fire about it. Okay, so at 5 weeks, we talked about that. We talked about the fetus going from an embryo to a fetus. The limb buds, remember those fin, like kind of webbed hands and toes. You can start to see the eyes, heart and liver, and rudiments of all the other organs have started to develop, and they're only about 1 centimeter long. This is very small. Then we talked about 14 weeks, which is growth and development of the offspring, now called a fetus. And it continues into that second trimester. The fetus is about 6 centimeters long at 14 weeks. Then we just started to see some pictures at 20 weeks. And by the end of the second trimester, which is at 24 weeks, the fetus grows to be about 30 centimeters in length. We now transition to the third trimester, and this is where the weight gain is about 1 pound per week. The fetus rotates so that the head is pointed towards the cervix, or maybe you've heard of like head down. The growth can go from about 8 inches to about 20 inches, 20.5 inches, and we can get up to about 6 to 7.5 pounds. Okay. Here at 29 weeks, you have the length being 27.5 and the weight being about 46 ounces, or like 1,300 grams. I guess I don't really measure things in grams very often in real life, just in science. But then about 10 weeks later, 39 weeks is considered full term, okay? With our technology nowadays, we can deliver, the hypothetical people, doctors, people of our times, I can't, deliver babies at a range of time around this full term. And it depends on the individual. People who maybe are at high risk pregnancies, who are a little bit older, who are having more than one baby, like twins or triplets or things like that, may not be recommended to go to full term, whereas some are recommended to wait until after full term. So it doesn't just necessarily mean that at week 39, it just bam, it happens, that the baby's delivered. But it says 40 weeks, it's not recommended to induce labor or deliver by C-section before 39 weeks. So that's what I was saying. So if you're at 39 weeks, usually they wait until about 40 if they're going to induce labor. So inducing labor means that they would either, there's some ways to do it with medication or trying naturally to induce labor. And then a C-section is essentially where they take an incision out of the lower abdomen and deliver the baby through that instead of naturally through the cervix, okay? This is just to show you some developmental stages, the 8-week embryo to the 12-week embryo, and then from 12 weeks until a newborn, they do have this characteristics that are very similar. And from the 8-week to the 12-week is a lot of developmental kind of, not necessarily growth, a little bit of growth for sure, but definitely from 12 to newborn is just a lot of getting bigger, getting longer, getting, I mean, essentially stronger too, I guess, if you think about it. Okay, so what's happening in the stages of birth or labor? Okay, first we're gonna have some dilation. Just have you ever gone to the eye doctor and got your eyes dilated? Same thing is kind of going on here, except for this is the cervix dilates, okay? It's a hormonal response that the body recognizes in order to kind of identify, recognize, it's like, hey, we're gonna deliver a baby, okay? So it sends hormones to the area, the cervix, and it says, let's dilate, let's get a little bit bigger to deliver this baby. The uterine contractions occur at this time every 15 to 20 minutes, and they last for about 40 seconds each. And you'll see as we get a little bit down the line here that the contractions are going to get a little bit more frequent. Okay, so we dilated, now we're gonna have expulsion. Okay, so the second stage of birth is when the baby emerges. The head is down, okay, so here's the vaginal birth channel here, and the head is down. We're going to deliver the baby. The uterine contractions at this point are occurring every 1 to 2 minutes, more frequent, and they're lasting a little bit longer. So we went even 20 seconds longer and more frequent. There are it's not really not known as well, but there is an afterbirth of delivery of the placenta, which is not often talked about. The afterbirth is delivered usually about 15 minutes after the birth of the baby, and this contains the placenta and the remaining parts of the umbilical cord that are also birthed after the baby. So that would be the 3 steps to labor: dilation, expulsion, and then delivery. On the first slide, when we were talking about the points to ponder, I said we were going to define a teratogen. This is a substance that can induce a malformation during development, okay? The first one that probably came to mind was alcohol, because we saw what it did to the egg when we soaked it in alcohol for 3 days, okay? The placenta is not a perfect barrier to drugs and chemicals and diseases. And this is because, one, the placenta develops within the uterus. It's not like women walk around with a placenta all the time. So this is a new-ish organ in the body. And it's made to have a gas exchange and get nutrients. It doesn't have a selective sort of barrier by any means. So any of the drugs, chemicals, alcohol, diseases, all of those things can be passed on to the fetus or the baby. The fetus is most sensitive in the first trimester. Lots of miscarriages happen in the first trimester. It's actually the most common time. And this is because either people don't know they're pregnant and they continue to use drugs, chemicals, things like that as they would normally. And it doesn't allow for a viable embryo. It can also be because the fetus is developing a lot of the major organs during this time in the first essentially 8 to 12 weeks. You're developing a lot of the major organs, heart, lungs, things like that, stomach, that you can't really mess up, right? Because after the stages that we get in the first trimester, you just start to grow and develop and get bigger. The effect that a teratogenic agent has on a developing fetus depends upon the stage during development when the fetus is exposed. I really like this picture. I think it's kind of informative. So essentially it shows the embryonic period in weeks across the top. And when you see a graph that has 2 little slashes through it like this on the top right, that just means that some time has passed, but we're still on track. So while it's not to scale, this is considered like a full pregnancy, okay? So like the first 8 weeks, you can see it's on black, and then we go 9 and 16. Don't worry, I know how to count, but it's 9, 16, 20 to 38, and then 38, okay? This also shows down here how long it takes to develop some of the major organs and when it starts to develop, which is really cool. So your central nervous system, you, the hypothetical person, fetus, whatever, is developing the whole time, okay? While it starts initially here in the first 3 to 6 weeks, until the day of delivery or birth, central nervous system is developing, okay? If you think about it, it's not just that we have to develop a brain and a spinal cord. All of the nerves within your body also have to be developed. It's kind of like a tree branch situation where they have different kind of wires and things like that all have to be developed throughout the body. These sensations are connected to all the organs, lungs, stomach, things like that. And we know that because of our hormonal responses that we have as humans. Your heart is developed between like 3.5 weeks to 8 weeks. Arms, eyes, legs, teeth, the palate, or being able to taste, external genitalia, and your ears or your hearing are developed kind of in the middle there. So if there was some sort of kind of damaging teratogen, such as a chemical, exposure to a drug that's not healthy to be on while pregnant, And if it was kind of administered during a certain week, you could see how it could affect that fetus and the development of that certain thing. One of them being the central nervous system, which is the brain, spinal cord, nerves. Seems like a pretty important one. As you can see, the central nervous system is kind of indicated by this little dot here, but then also it goes over to the 20 to 38 weeks, and we're still developing the brain at that point. So this brain and the central nervous system is complex. As we know, our brains are very complex, so it takes the whole time to develop. So if you or the hypothetical person were to overindulge in alcohol at 3.5 weeks or 4 weeks, maybe even 5 weeks pregnant. Sometimes people don't even know they're pregnant then. Look at everything that happens at 5 weeks. Your central nervous system, your heart, your arms, your eyes, your legs, and your ears. There's a lot going on at that time. Lots of development going on here, okay? And it's not until, usually about like 7, 8 weeks that people start to sometimes tell sometimes people tell their family right away, but some people like to wait and tell people that they're pregnant until about 7, 8, 9 weeks, because a lot can have happened in those first 8 weeks. So they usually say to kind of wait to tell people because of that as well. Okay, so it says, how could it have this birth defect been prevented? Okay, so here we show an image of an infant, of a child, and this person has some deformities of the fingers as well as the arms are a little bit shortened. So if we go back a couple of slides, we're guessing that somewhere in here where the arms and the fingers were developing, that they had some sort of issue. One of them can be substance abuse during pregnancy. So it says, based on a survey of U.S. pregnant women, 18% smoked cigarettes, 11.2% drank alcohol, 4.5% engaged in binge drinking, and 4.6% used illicit drugs. Okay, some of them are maybe if they didn't know they were pregnant, and so they technically, yes, used it while they were pregnant, and some of them, it's just a part of the lifestyle. Rates of the substance abuse in pregnancy have remained relatively constant. So you would think like, oh, now that we have more research about the negative effects of having, drugs, alcohol, smoking, things like that being really bad for pregnancy, the rates have remained relatively constant. Although tobacco use has decreased, alcohol and illicit drugs use has increased, and substance use is the highest in the first trimester, which kind of makes sense, right? If it's the first trimester, some people don't know they're pregnant. Some people do know they're pregnant and they're under a lot of stress because maybe it was an unplanned pregnancy and things like that. Okay, current cigarette use among adults, behavior risk factor surveillance system in 2014. Okay, so what you can see here, and it's not the best picture up on the projector, but you'll have a chance to look at this on your own slides if you'd like. The map is kind of color coordinated and it's by percentage. So the percentage of current cigarette usage among adults. So you maybe find the state that you're from, or you can look at Iowa, or even look at some of those states that are a little bit darker in color in blue. That means that they have a higher percentage of current cigarette usage among adults. The then weighted of the amount of alcohol use among women ages 18 to 14 years old, or did I say 18 to 14? 18 to 44 years old, as you can see. So as the color gets a little bit darker in blue, so from light blue to teal to navy, you can see that in some of the states, especially Iowa, we have a lot of alcohol usage among women 18 to 44 years old. So this isn't necessarily for pregnancy, but what it's showing is overall, there's a lot of usage of these normally for adults and women. All right, so neonatal abstinence syndrome. This is how we talked about how every drug passes from the mother's bloodstream through the placenta to the fetus. So that substance can cause a drug dependence and somewhat of an addiction, pretty serious addiction in the mother, but also the fetus then becomes dependent on that drug. And at birth, the baby's central nervous system, it becomes overstimulated, causing withdrawal symptoms. And when I was in high school, I got to job shadow a nurse in the OB unit at the hospital. And we actually got to experience a baby who was dependent on drugs. And the baby reacts by crying and screaming a lot because it's, like it says, it's overstimulated. The body just feels like it needs that drug to survive. Okay, so after birth, it says the baby does suffer from withdrawal. And so you're saying, come on, placenta, like, what are you doing, right? That placenta needs to be a little bit more selective. Well, because all the nutrients can go through the placenta, so can drugs. And it passes from that baby from the placenta to the baby.
Quick question,
Yes.
how do they treat that in babies? Is there anything they can do or?
Yeah, sometimes they have to slowly give the baby the drug a little bit. They also have, I'm gonna shut the door. They also have, I think, some medication that can like act like it. I'm gonna have to look up exactly what that is. But when I was there, they had to slowly, I think it was heroin. They would give the baby small doses of it to essentially wean the baby off of the drug, which is also very sad and interesting.
The drug's called Suboxone.
Yes, that's what it
the
is.
same they
Thank
give,
you.
Like adults too, but
Yes.
it's like, yeah, so you come down off the drugs and you don't suffer as bad.
Exactly, that's what it was. Thank you. I knew it existed, I just didn't know what it was
Yeah.
called. All right, so prenatal drug exposure. Withdrawal symptoms in newborns can be associated to exposures of all of these things. So if the mother was a binge drinker and binge drank for 39 weeks, that baby will come out and is addicted to alcohol and it will have withdrawal symptoms. Same with all of these other substances here, like tobacco, opioids, amphetamines, barbiturates, and benzodiazepines. The single substance exposure, so this graph is showing like maybe the mom didn't know she was pregnant, used a substance once during pregnancy, and then maybe found out they were pregnant and stopped using a substance, or maybe it was like a one-time thing or an accident or whatever. That only accounts for 34%. Because 66% are polysubstance exposure, so meaning it's a multiple reoccurring act, either because of unknowing, mental health, lifestyle, safety, stress, all of those things can go into play here. Okay, so a think, pair, share coming up next. So if you don't want to be in a group, that's okay. You can sit by yourself and think about this, and then we can share. Or if you'd like to talk to the person next to you, this is a question on your homework as well. We're going to ask the question, should we have mandatory testing for pregnant women for drugs and alcohol? And everybody's opinion is valid, and we can listen to everyone's opinion. The kind of bullet point questions there is like, would it protect children? Would it discourage prenatal care? Or would it discourage women from seeking treatment at all? I'll give you guys about 1 minute to talk if you'd like to talk to the person next to you and share your opinions. Ready, set, go. Or you can whisper if you're.
Yeah, I think it would discourage. Yeah, I think that would discourage her because, you know, like I'm recovering out because sometimes it's hard to get help, right? So if you know you have a problem, then they start doing this, now you've got one cousin, so it's been two, right? So now you have a mom and a baby on test treatment, as opposed to just one, you know? Yeah.
I mean, it would protect the child, but again, the girl has all the decisions to make now for the.
Right, yeah.
So, yeah.
If you're addicted, you don't want help. You're not going to go see a therapist.
Right. Well, yeah, if you knew they were testing you, you're not going, you know, or it'd be very hard to go.
All right, does anybody want to share at all with the whole class what you talked about? Okay, if you don't want to.
Personally, I think it'd be something we should do just for the protection of children, but I think legally it will never be mandated because it's a violation of public rights and your privacy, so, you know, on one hand, I think, yeah, because, just for the safety of the children, but I also think no, because it just won't ever happen. Because it is very private. And then I think, yeah, it would discourage prenatal care. It would discourage women from seeking treatment. But it's just another thing, it's like, oh, great, so now I have to open up my life. And maybe like her husband's an alcoholic too, and she's like, well, he doesn't have to, you know? What about the father? He's an alcoholic, but I can't be, so, you know? I think that also separates women and it could be sexist too.
Yeah,
In a way.
I appreciate that perspective. I forgot to mention that too. It's sometimes like with the lifestyle, if the partner uses a substance, then it's more likely as well because of that. Yeah. Anybody else want to share something? Yeah, Luke.
Yeah, we also thought about like even if you catch somebody with drugs or alcohol while they're pregnant, like what are you gonna do?
Yeah. Like how would you enforce it, or what's the protocol after that? Yeah.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to send them to jail if they're pregnant. And technically, it's not illegal. We don't know how to make that illegal. Where's the boundaries?
You can't make them do anything, like, you know, you could like tell them all their options and everything, but it's like a doctor and like they can't really make them stop.
I feel like, to parents, we thought like it could be something like, almost like optional, like a screening test that just asks basic questions. And like, if the person wants to talk about it, and as like the doctor, you can talk to that patient about, you know, the effects that drug and alcohol can have on a child. And it, like, just keep it kind of optional, because truly we can't like force someone to do something because it isn't like illegal. Like, unfortunately.
Definitely.
I actually have a question. So, like it depends, but like isn't there some substances, like some drugs that are illegal to use? I don't know if this would be, like, some people might not come forward if they're using those drugs because would it be covered under doctor-patient confidentiality because it is illegal?
Yeah. So you're talking like a drug that is illegal for everyone? Yeah. So like meth, right? If the doctor, you know, does a blood screening of the pregnant woman and there's meth in the system, right? Like what happens at that point?
Yeah.
I think it is, I don't want to be wrong here because my thought is that it is under HIPAA that they can't just turn it in. I think there's some like doctor-patient confidentiality. I think that they offer a lot of help and resources at that point, but I don't think that it's.
I kind of know.
Yeah.
Well, if they can't, so if they find out before the baby's born, until the baby, so there's nothing they can do.
Yeah.
They can maybe give, like if the pregnant woman says, hey, I've got a problem,
Yeah.
they can refer to a social worker or
Yeah.
something. Nothing legally they can do till the baby touches air.
Yeah.
Then DHS can come in and they can take the baby immediately.
Oh, yeah.
Especially if you've already had a kid
Yes.
that has been, you know, positive for drugs, or depending on what that state law is, they'll come and take it immediately. But
Okay.
that's usually the general law. There's nothing we can do when it's in the womb. But when it hits the air, then now we can intervene.
Yes. I knew about the, while they're pregnant, they can't do anything, but it's good
Like
to know
office
about.
services,
Yeah.
like basically if they
Yeah.
want them, you know, and you can't follow a pregnant lady around for however many weeks. And
Yeah.
Hey.
Yeah.
Can't exactly be that hard though.
Yeah.
theoretically, they probably don't want to be moving too much, but at least later in pregnancy anyway.
Oh, yeah.
She's not gonna run away that far.
On some
Hey.
nights she might,
Yeah.
just saying.
Might go down to Mexico.
All right.
Do you think, like, in future, do you think more laws could come out about that? I don't know how big the problem is. The problem is still there, but, you know, I wonder if that ever could happen.
Yeah. I think it just goes into like how much of it is a government problem, I guess. I don't know. Is it, and yeah, I think that's definitely just another opinionated question. I couldn't say that it's like, yep, they're gonna come out with more because that's, I don't know that.
But
for
I can
sure.
also tell you that adoption, with children in adoption, the numbers are astronomical.
Mhm.
So like, where do we cross the line that maybe we should enforce this? Because then it helps with the adoptions and how many children are not in families. You see it as that too.
Yeah. I'm not the expert, but if you have an idea, definitely reach out to someone who could help. All right. Well, that's the end of the PowerPoint. Okay. What we can do now, if you're ready, is we can talk about the exam if you'd like. Yeah. Yeah.
So there's like a study that came out that said that pregnant women who got the COVID vaccination, their babies when they were born were tested and had the COVID antigens.
Antibodies.
Happen?
Yeah. So if, so I saw that article too. So my thought is that it depends what the vaccine was, which type, because if it was, Moderna, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, which type is going to affect the baby differently? Do you remember what the article said, which vaccine it was?
I don't remember which one.
I'll have to look it up too. My guess is if it's the mRNA one, so we are, and it depends at what time in the pregnancy that happened too. But what goes on then is that as the baby develops and the gas exchange is happening, the messenger RNA essentially goes to tell your proteins essentially how to react to this vaccine, okay? And those proteins can also be within your bloodstream and passed on to the baby, kind of like a vitamin and nutrient would, if you can kind of imagine that in your mind of something like floating in the bloodstream. So that's how it could happen. So it's kind of sending a message to the baby's genetics essentially that can say, hey, this is what this is. And so the baby could develop antibodies or antigens like that. I'm sure they're doing a lot more studies on it, and it's possible I could be wrong too, but that would be my guess. Yeah. Cool. Interesting time we live in. Okay. All right, so on the exam, the date is probably wrong. On my Wartburg, it says 27th. It's actually going to be the 29th, which is Monday. And we will have a 2-hour time cap. Like I said, you can find the exam on my Wartburg, just how you can find the other exams. You'll need your lockdown browser, so kind of plan ahead for that. Usually what happens if somebody emails me and is like, hey, my lockdown browser is not working, I usually just try and let you in a few more times. I try my best to be next to my computer. Sometimes it'll take me 1 hour to get back to you, sometimes 2, but I'll be understanding. It's not like if you get locked out that I'm like, sorry, I didn't get back to you in 2 hours and now it's gone. So that's not the case. It's over chapters 9, 10, 17, and 18. You do not have to do chapters 13 and 12. That is on the last exam. You do need to know a little bit about the digestive and the respiratory system. We talked about the structures and functions of each of those systems. I would know which organs belong to which. So if you said that the trachea is a part of the digestive system, you would be incorrect in that statement. So knowing like the esophagus is for the digestive system, the trachea is for the respiratory system, just kind of knowing a few of those organs will help you with that. We've got, let's see here, the function of swallowing, or like the process of swallowing food. Maybe a couple about some of these intolerances, like what is celiac disease if you have or know somebody who has celiac? What is a lactose intolerance and how does that affect our digestive system? Respiratory system, what about breathing is involuntary? We talked about one part of breathing is active, like you have to kind of tell your body to do it, and the other is involuntary. Knowing the different parts of the respiratory system, so what distinguishes between the upper and the lower respiratory system, and knowing the mechanism of breathing. Yeah, do you have a question or are you just looking at me?
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I realized I was doing something funny with my face, but, what's the mechanism? Like, what do you mean by the mechanism of breathing? What do you mean by that, I guess?
Yeah, so when we start to use like talking about our diaphragm and like kind of how the diaphragm like pulls down and the muscles of the intercostal ribs contract and expand, and then the air comes in, and then the diaphragm kind of relaxes and releases and it pushes the air out. So kind of that mechanism of the organs that are going on there. Good. And then reproductive system and pregnancy is what we went over this week, describing the human life cycle. So in this question here, we didn't talk a bunch about this, but essentially what you could know about this question is like, at what point is the reproductive system able to actually reproduce, which would be puberty, maybe knowing the difference between like eggs and sperm, how females are born with all the eggs, but they mature after puberty, where sperm is just starting to produce after puberty in males. The male reproductive system, know the parts and the functions, understand the hormone regulations. So I think we talked about that LH hormone, testosterone, those are some good ones. And then knowing what the energy source is for sperm, those accessory things we talked about with the sugary substance that helps give the sperm energy. The alkaline substance from the sperm in the semen that allow it to buffer the acidity of the vaginal pH. Then you have the female reproductive system, knowing the parts, functions, hormone regulation. We saw a couple of graphs about hormone regulation through the menstrual cycle specifically would be important. But then knowing the phases of the ovarian cycle, what hormone is at a peak during ovulation, which is on that graph as well. You guys remember that graph I'm talking about? There's like two parts to the graph. We looked at them separately. Understanding fertilization and pregnancy, which also can go into chapter 18. Some birth control methods, we talked about that in lab. That would be a good question. What are some assisted reproductive technologies? So like IVF and things like that. Chapter 18 today, we talked about each trimester of the pregnancies and maybe being able to describe what happens in each trimester in your own words, being able to describe steps of fertilization in detail and why each step is important. And then what is the importance of the placenta and where is that placenta located? And I'd even maybe add like what step the placenta is essentially expelled out of the body, which we talked about today, which is delivery. So just knowing about delivery. Oops, I spelled that wrong. Does anybody have any questions about the exam? Yes.
Like I know, like in the past, you've kind of given us like a rundown of like components of the test. Would you be willing to do that again?
Yes. Let me count here. I have it pulled up. 1, 2, Okay, so we've got 11 multiple choice, 3 matching. We've got 2 ordering, so that would be like put the steps in order. We've seen one of those questions before where it's like start with this and end with this, and here's the 5 steps, which is kind of cool about that question because if I say start with this and end with this, usually that means you have to just put the 3 in the middle in the correct order, if that makes sense. And then we have 1, 2, 5, but I may change one. So I would just say 5 or 6 essay questions. But you know what essay means? It just means short answer. It just gives you a bigger space to write. Because if I were to make it a short answer question, I think it gives you like 50 characters or something silly to write in, and some people would need more space. So that's kind of what that is. It's 100 points as usual. Sometimes I'll throw in like a silly question like I did last time, like what's the cover of your textbook, which is just a bonus for having the textbook. Question like that once in a while doesn't hurt. Other questions?
I read that one and I was like, wait, really?
Well, normally when we do face-to-face exams, I do give extra credit, like at the top, and they're usually funny things that we talked about in class, but with you guys getting to use your books and stuff, I think that's kind of your extra credit, if that makes sense. Yeah. Good. Well, feel free to ask me any individual questions, or if you have a question while you're studying over the weekend, let me know. But that's all I have for you guys. So enjoy your weekend.